Dialectics. What the hell is it? Abstract. Dialectics has historically meant many things throughout its life, each stage furthering the concept of such and making it more and more concrete within reality. This post will serve as an introduction to every case the dialectic has existed throughout history, and to document as such from this point of history. Note this post will not go into depth onto every case of such, and will serve only as a superficial but necessary understanding of each formation of the dialectic. With this said, there stands three major cases of the evolution of dialectics: Antiquity, Hegelian, and Marxist. Each will get their own respects as much as they have played with dialectics. Antiquity. From antiquity, people such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had used dialectics in what we now call, or they called, the dialectical method. Nota bene that Aristotle had a limited use of the dialectics in comparison to Socrates and Plato. This dialectical method served as a means to compare two ideas in a locked competition until either one wins out, both lose, or both combine to form a synthesis that hadn't been there before. Nota bene, that it was imperative to hear all the sides of the argument, but it was imperative that at least two ideas were the ones to begin it out. Regardless of that case, and that nota bene, the first case is usually when the survivor of the conflict had grown stronger because they were the one to win the conflict, and the other rots for they have lost in such conflict. For the middle case is the failure case of both sides, since neither had resolved the main issue and both remain ignorant in a way. The last case is when both equally had resolved the conflict that led not to the annihilation of both of them, and both grew stronger because of the conflict. Nota bene, once again, that these three cases appear again later when you get into Hegel or Marx, except that both take a different twist in these three cases, especially with the synthesis case. Now anyways, how does the dialectical method work? Well, first, you must have a mindset that things change over time. For the lack of a better phrasing, think of evolutionary thinking when you hear the dialectical method. Regardless of that, then you must accept that ideas, arguments, and philosophies aren't transhistoric and cannot live in a vacuum. Or to put it in another way, things that happened in a point of history can only possibly happen in that point of time alone, and was heavily influenced by events at that time and before it during its conception. Finally, you must take an idea and compare it in the totality of the system and the particulars, that being parts, of the system as well. The main assumption throughout the entire method is that things cannot exist in isolation. Nota bene, which is a 180 to the metaphysical method's assumption, or metaphysics in general, where things can exist in isolation. The dialectics say things cannot live within isolation. Now, since the dialectic was in its beginning stage, 'twas only so useful in the confines of the past, and human history had only started to gain traction around that time. It, of course, will see serious development in its later forms and be more than a method for the struggle of ideas. Hegelian Dialectics. Hegelian Dialectics was a major modernization and overhaul to how dialectics were used and perceived throughout the Western tradition in philosophy. It retained the character of antiquity with being more useful than being relegated to pure conversations. It became more than a way of logic. It became its own theory of logic. In fact, science, yes, uppercase S science, which he refers to as Wissenschaft, would be massive throughout his works, and reasoned his way to use it and dialectics to work together. By that time, it would be attributed in the form of the triad, that being thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Nota bene, that this triad is usually misattributed to Hegel thanks to Fichte. Yet Hegel never talks of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He talks of abstract, negative, concrete, Aufheben, Aufhebung, and mediation. Abstract, negative, concrete, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis, if we're talking only in a Marxist tongue, makes it necessary for the thesis, abstract, to have an antithesis, negative, for the thesis is flawed and the antithesis can make it less flawed. The struggle between the two forms the synthesis, the concrete, that of which comes at the end of the struggle, taking from the past forms as it had already existed and ending on the addition from the antithesis at that very moment of the stage. What ought to be noted is that Hegel's and Marx's dialectics happen in a form of a helix, and not the simple triad talked about earlier. For reference, look at the post's picture. It is a representation of a negative supersession, that of which we will talk about later, but mind you, only one side of the double helix, that is, the dialectics. Regardless of that, the dialectically negative supersession starts with a thesis, the abstract, that later interacts with the antithesis, the negative. But I like to mind you that it is not the antithesis that does the work, but the force of the antithesis that interacts with the thesis. And in that interaction, it results in a synthesis from that struggle, and it continues on until the end of history, with the synthesis always becoming the new thesis, until finally there is nothing to contradict with anything else. But I like to also mind you that there's a great confusion going around that dialectics is a pendulum, which is incredibly crass and antithetical to dialectics. Dialectics just don't swing side to side until it finds inner peace. It is a hectic process that has no resolve, as it forces everything to march forward constantly. It is the struggle of the past and the future, as we will be seeing in Marxist dialectics as well, with the resolve coming at the end of history. So wait a second, what the hell is a synthesis for Hegel? Hegel would see synthesis, the concrete, not only as a repository stage of the conflict, but also as the Aufheben, Aufhebung of it as well. For Hegel uses Aufheben and Aufhebung first as abolish, a dialectically negative supersession, but also as an update, a dialectically positive supersession throughout his works. See, for Hegel and Marx, every conflict will resolve itself one way or the other. How they end up is another story, for there really are two cases instead of three. Annihilation is the first case. It is the case of unbecoming. The second case is that of triumph. One gets stronger in the face of the death of the other. The former case, annihilation, is a dead end. Think of Antiquity when you think of annihilation or unbecoming. And remember the scene where the two princes both kill each other, and neither of them live to tell the tale of how they fought. And when you think of the latter case, that of triumph, think of it as what makes progress and moves history forward. Finally, mediation, albeit this pair will be the shortest of all of them. Everything happens for Hegel and Marx and Engels and every Hegelian and Marxist thereafter in a medium and mediation. Even things that appeared to be immediate had a medium that they had to pass through. Intuitiveness, hypocritical only in itself, also has a medium to pass through in order to work through the things and to connect the dots through a systematic way. It has to consult with the knowledge in its mind. Thusly, intuitiveness is really a fast counterintuition. For every struggle between the abstract thesis and negative antithesis has a medium where they can interact with each other and struggle as well. And this medium is the way these two conflicts influence each other and allows the history of philosophy and the march of history to continue on. Marxist dialectics. Finally, Marxist dialectics. In its most current form of dialectics, it has been refined with modern ideologies, modern philosophies, and modern history. For if Hegel was the one to overhaul the machine, then Marx and Engels were the one to make it more compatible and concrete with the times. So what did Marx and Engels brought to the table that Hegel didn't? Materialism. In making the dialectics fit within them, materialism and science, and being able to make all three of them work together. For it was to make Marx's and Engels' findings realistic with the times. Their reason for such developments and theory crafting was due to the fact that they were young Hegelians before breaking off with the group in the left-right split. Meanwhile, both of them wanting to salvage what could be salvaged from Hegel's work. Yet a rooting out was in order for the absolute idealism in dialectics. Materialism was Marx's way of salvaging dialectics from the absolute idealism of Hegel and making dialectics, as aforementioned, concrete. Materialism, on its part, made all theory grounded on reality and inverses Hegel's quote on the facts. As Hegel would say it, if facts contradict my theory, so much worse for the facts. This is where both materialism and science come together to ground dialectics in reality and form theory upon reality, not forcing reality to theory. In essence, Marx made the materialist version of dialectics, also known as dialectical materialism. Another thing to note in this trend is that, if it wasn't heavily implied enough, Marx and Engels inverted Hegel's philosophy. With such heavy inversions of Hegel and his dialectics, it's no surprise some aspects that surrounded dialectics would also change. One important trend was making the object more important than the subject in perception and consciousness. This plays a major role for both Marxist and Engels' view of consciousness, i.e., class consciousness, in relationship to society, i.e., superstructure. Another being how groups, i.e., classes, of society look at each other, i.e., relationships, what qualifies them in society, i.e., relationship to production, and how they eventually come to a struggle that cannot exist in peace, i.e., class conflict, that eventually results in revolutions. Yet, the talk of historical materialism can be saved for another time. Concrete. All in all, the dialectic has transformed itself throughout history from antiquity to now. Meanwhile, this post didn't include the entire history of philosophy of the dialectics in relationship to what we classify as dialectics, like Eastern versions of dialectics, medieval Europe's usage of dialectics, or Western philosophers like Kant that has certain perception of dialectics. This is because they are left field when in comparison to the ones that had a very serious and very important impact to the world at large. With some exception for the beginning case, as it had an impact to the Eastern Asian world. Footnotes. The first one being science. Wissenschaft incorporates lowercase s science, that being lab coat science, learning, knowledge, scholarship, and implies that knowledge is a dynamic process discoverable for oneself rather than being something that is handed down. The second footnote is concrete. Concrete is used here to mean more solid and less abstract in form. The third case is inverted. Inverted in this case means that Marx didn't turn Hegel upside down. That would literally mean that he took the conclusions to prove the premises. Nonetheless, that would also leave out the important contributions that Marx and Engels brought to the dialectics as a whole. Inversion, or turning something inside out, is a more proper comparison of Marx and Engels to Hegel, since it actually reflects the seriousness of Marx's works. The last case is superstructure. It is the ideological part of society, the one that is built upon and maintained by the basis society, that being the economy of society. The base is also maintained and built upon by the superstructure in turn, for the superstructure will always support a base that allows it to exist.